Winter is coming.
And I say that not because I live in Sweden where it's already 6 degrees Celsius outside. Oh no, I said the word. In this video, I'll offer you a different perspective on the energy crisis that I don't think you've heard before in all the other videos released already. As you know, Europe is struggling to contain an energy crisis, wreaking havoc in energy markets, and it's affecting the world and the global markets. Because what happens when electricity prices skyrocket, like here in Stockholm, Sweden, August 2020, August 2021, August 2022. And there's talks about 10 times increase in free markets. Then almost everything becomes more expensive to produce. Then businesses will sell less, slowing growth. Also when prices go up, it's adding to inflation problems. Then central banks tighten policies. And what happens when business is down, inflation is up, and monetary policies get more hawkish? Well, market crash. So key to maneuvering these markets is to understand if this problem is really temporary, Putin bad, or is it a bigger, fundamental issue, and Russia turning off this particular gas pipe to Europe now was just the spark that ignited this problem? I've talked many times about the value of understanding the fundamentals, and in this video I will first give you that, the fundamental, technical principles of energy production as an engineer, and then we move on to the economic consequences going forward. So bear with me here, and I hope the learnings will stay with you, maybe for life. And I'll cut right to the chase. The problem isn't only Putin, because we in the world are using more and more energy. Look at the slope of this curve. But what about renewables? At least in the US and here in Europe, where the immediate crisis lies now, aren't we transitioning to renewable energy? Why is this gas pipeline even an issue? Well, if we stick to the world level first for a moment. Oil, coal, gas, nuclear, hydro, here comes wind, here is solar, biofuels, other renewables. Alright, but maybe that's just poor countries far away, right? Well, here is United States. This is coal, this is oil, this is gas, this is nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, other. Here is Sweden. Coal, oil, gas, nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, sun doesn't shine much here, other renewables. Germany, coal, oil, gas, nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, other. Here is the world view in percent. Renewables have increased as a portion, but it's still small. And those percentage figures are quite misleading, because if you look at the actual number, gas, coal, oil, this is solar, this is wind. So it's increasing a lot compared to how much wind it was before. But in absolute number, it's actually increasing less. So when we look at pictures like this, how much of our energy comes from renewables? And it looks very green and nice here in the Western world, in Europe and in the US. Until we find the scale down here. And we realize that this is like 10%, or Germany 19%, France 13%. And when we go back to oil, this looks only light yellow, right? But this actually is 38%. And Germany has 33%, plus 16% from coal, and then another 25% from gas. And what about the greenhouse effect? Natural gas is presented as a more environmentally friendly alternative to oil. Look here, Germany has really transitioned to gas, the green choice. So, is it? And is the greenhouse effect even real? Or is it all a hoax? Well, the greenhouse effect works, guys. Or the Earth would have been an average of minus 18 degrees Celsius, 0 degree Fahrenheit, instead of plus 14 degrees Celsius, 57 degrees Fahrenheit. 200 years ago, Joseph Fourier figured it out. Same guy with the Fourier transform. And then 100 years ago, Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius largely figured it out in 1869 on the confluence of carbonic acid in the air upon the temperature of the ground by Professor Svante Arrhenius. How it works is that a lot of the sun radiation passes through the atmosphere. As you know, the visible spectrum that we can see with our eyes passes well through the oxygen molecules, the CO2 molecules, the water vapor, passing through the total atmosphere, and we can see it nicely with our eyes. Then some of this energy is emitted back from the Earth's surface in the form of infrared radiation. The infrared spectrum is here on this chart, and then you can see that Some of that is stopped by oxygen molecules, some other parts is stopped by CO2 molecules, some other parts is stopped by H2O, water molecules, and if we look at the compound atmosphere, we see that a lot of this spectrum is actually stopped. It's absorbed by those molecules. And then when it's absorbed, it's then scattered and emitted back in all different directions. Some out in space, but some also back to the Earth's surface. And that's what keeps us warm. So if we add more of this CO2 stuff into the atmosphere, of course it gets warmer here. That this dude could figure out 100 years ago. This isn't rocket science. This scientist is not to be confused with other Swedish scientists who were also dealing with temperatures and thermometer scales, who wasn't Fahrenheit, but we don't talk about him anymore, right? So these fuel types then: coal, oil, gas. I'm not gonna call it natural gas. That's like naturally dead dinosaur oil or clean coal or something equally dumb. To really understand this, we need to go back to the fundamentals. And bear with me here, even if you never understood this in primary school, you're gonna get it today. Let's start with coal. If you have coal and you burn it with oxygen, in the ideal case, you get only CO2, plus the energy that we want to get out. And this CO2 into the atmosphere isn't good. That is a simplification. Here is the 392-page presentation of the combustion of coal. But right now, that's all we need to know. The gas then that comes in Putin's pipeline, it's this gas that you typically see on a gas stove. Methane or methane or however it's pronounced in English. This is the methane molecule. Then when you add oxygen, for each carbon atom, that's C, you get 1 CO2 and 2 H2O. And the H2O is fine because that's going to mingle with the rest of the water in the air. So this was the methane molecule. If we now compare that with oil-based fuels, like gasoline, we see that those molecules are much bigger. There's more carbon and less hydrogen. You can see that, right? Compare with this one. So if we then look at the combustion of one of those molecules, here we have 2 times 8 carbons, so we have 16 carbons, then we get 16 CO2, same number of carbon as CO2, but we get only 18 H2O. So here we get almost the same number of CO2 as H2O, while in the case of hydrogen, we got twice as many H2O as we got CO2. So with gas, methane, we get proportionally less of the CO2 versus the H2O compared to oil-based fuels, and with coal we only get CO2. So for example, for shipping fuel, there's less CO2 with gas than with the oil-based fuels. And if we look per energy that we get out, CO2 per energy produced, we see gas here at 53 versus coal at 95, propane, motor gasoline, jet fuel, industrial petroleum fuel, different type of coal, but the ratio is like 53 versus maybe 70 for gasoline or 90 maybe for coal. So it's like 30% less or 50% less. It's not a tenth or 1% or something like that. It's not like proof of stake energy consumption versus proof of work energy consumption. And then there's another problem. Natural gas is much dirtier energy source than we thought. Because this methane is a gas, it can sneak out. So even if we use a very optimistic number of emissions with coals being reduced from 765 to gas with 433, even if there is just 1% leakage in the end-to-end process from extraction to finally having used it, that number bumps to 503. And if there's 3% leakage, that's 704, which is pretty close to the coal number. So yes, gas releases a little less CO2 per energy generated, but it's not a night and day difference, especially considering leaks. It's still a fossil fuel. Putin isn't an environmentalist for delivering gas pipelines to Europe. So what about nuclear then? That does not produce any greenhouse gases, no CO2 at all. The nuclear reaction heats up water to boiling, which then powers a turbine, pretty similar to a steam engine, just a nuclear reaction instead of the coal. Back to basics. And nuclear also requires substantially less land than wind and solar. Wind needs like 2,000 times as much land, and solar 400 times as much land than a nuclear reactor in sunny places, and much more of course in god-forsaken dark corners of the world like Sweden. But then there is another problem instead. or rather two problems. The first one being that it happens. And while we can argue that the Chernobyl disaster in 1986 in the north of Ukrainian SSR in the Soviet Union was caused by reactor design flaws and human error, it's much harder to claim that Japanese people are sloppy in modern day. But I have high faith in engineering, and maybe those problems can be improved on over time. So if we look at the principal, fundamental issues instead, there is nuclear waste piling up, even when things work like they should. And if we look, for example, here in Sweden, we have a plan for final disposal of spent nuclear fuel. Just to construct the repository and put the stuff there will take 70 years. And then the solution is this. First you put the pellets of radioactive uranium dioxide in this tube, then you put that in a copper canister with a cast iron insert. Then you put that in bentonite clay, and then you put those 500 meters underground in the rock and seal it. And then it should be isolated for 100,000 years. I mean, it's 1,000 years since we lived in the Middle Ages here. I would maybe have put bigger faith in human innovation, and that we in another, for example, only 1,000 years ahead, have figured out a better way to break down these molecules. Now if we do, I guess it will be hard to get these suckers out again without breaking them. What about solar panels then? There's this discussion on the internet that creating the solar panels with all the steps and mining and everything actually consumes more energy than they produce. So is it even real, or is it all just for show? Well, there was some truth to the rumor that the industry was a net consumer of electricity as recently as 2010. But since somewhere around 2012, it is no longer the case. Even then, the generation of a system far exceeds the energy to produce it, assuming you're in some reasonably sunny place. That was a technology review. If we want to figure out where the world is going, it's usually a good idea to look at the front runners. Sweden, for example, is a rich country, and the environment is high up on the political agenda here. Here is Sweden's energy mix 1990 to 2020, meaning usage. And here is the production from 1970 to 2021. From the bottom we have water, wind, the yellow one here is nuclear, and the top two are industry heat power. And you can see here that the yellow portion, the nuclear, has reduced and been replaced largely by wind power, this smaller blue part down here, if we look in the recent years. If we go back to the 1980s, it was almost exclusively water power in the north, and in the south, where there are no big rivers, nuclear reactors. While there has been a non-negligible growth in wind power, those two energy sources from the 80s are still the main two sources today 40 years later. Transport sector. There, at least up until 2019, electricity is a very, very small part. The only thing that has changed from basically the 1970s is that gasoline has been replaced by diesel oil and to some extent biofuels. So if I try to conclude what I've learned from this technical refresher, it's this. Energy need in the world is constantly growing. Number 2, gas isn't that green. That's a narrative. Number 3, we're nowhere near replacing fossil fuels with solar and wind yet. Number 4, in Europe we managed to switch off nuclear before we have a replacement, instead of building the replacement first and then switching it off. Now we're scrambling to try to burn more fossil energy, and we can't even do that because we don't have the supply. Once again, there is shocking level of mismanagement among the European politicians. Not only trying to ban the next major technology revolution with blockchain, but now also doing a lot of damage to the old industries. Not great. If I've gotten something wrong in this section, please correct me in the comments. Now let's move on to the economics. This Sunday I went to vote in our election in Sweden, and almost all parties have controlling energy prices in their campaigns. Prices are so high everywhere else in Europe also. UK energy bills are set to increase by 80% in October, and it becomes impossible for some businesses to pay. And this is not only a price issue, we're also talking about possible blackouts, no heating in the winter, factories shut down and deep recession. Let's look at the demand and the supply side. Not only is energy demand rising from the US to Europe and Asia as a long-term trend, but also the economies recover from the pandemic. Of course, recovery is great for our industrial activity, but at the same time it raises concern about more inflation too. So actually COVID caused the largest decline in energy demand since 70 years. 7 times greater than the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Most of the decline was in the US and the EU. It fell 5% in the US, almost 7% here in the EU, but the effect is global too. So now that most countries are back to normal after 2 years of COVID, it is not surprising that the energy demand increases. Second, Europe has invested more in renewable energy, such as wind and solar, while investments in fossil fuels decline. Here's a graph that shows what percentage of renewable energy for different European countries. Sweden is 66.4%, EU average is 23%, best is Iceland. So this environmental policy in Europe has pushed many countries to shut their coal and nuclear plants. I'm very much pro-environmental solutions. As I explained, the greenhouse effect is real. I think the worries about the nuclear fuel storage is real. However, when there is a shortage, like now, it also means we don't have any backup sources for energy because we somehow managed to switch off the old system before building the new one. Or there are no engineers left, no idea. The supply side doesn't look very good either. Our top supplier, Russia, has cut the amount of gas it sends to Europe by shutting the key Nordstream 1 pipeline for the second time since this summer. Moscow says that the closure is necessary to allow repairs after the pandemic. But, well, yeah. Remember how gas was somehow not part of the sanctions. So what is Nord Stream 1 anyway, and how much gas does it actually supply? So the Nord Stream 1 pipeline stretches 1,200 kilometers under the Baltic Sea from the Russian coast near St. Petersburg to northeastern Germany. It opened in 2011 and it can send a maximum of 170 million cubic meters of gas per day from Russia to Germany. That is a lot. In May, Gazprom, a Russian state-owned energy corporation, closed a key pipeline which runs through Belarus and Poland and delivers gas to Europe and other European nations. Then in June, it cut gas deliveries through Nord Stream 1, this one, by 75%, from 170 million cubic meters of gas a day down to roughly 40 million cubic meters. Then in July, it shut down Nord Stream 1 for 10 days, saying it needs maintenance. Shortly after reopening, Gazprom halved its production down to 20 cubic meters because of what it called the faulty equipment. Of course, I don't know the facts of the matter. 2 days ago, here September 12, Nord Stream 1 remains shut, but Gazprom said on Monday that it will ship 42 million cubic meters of natural gas to Europe through Ukraine. So how is this hurting Europe? As you saw, Europe is very reliant on this gas, like Germany, which has historically been very reliant specifically on Russian gas to meet its energy needs. When Russia announced its intention to restrict supply in July, within 1 day, that had pushed up the wholesale price of gas in Europe by 10%. And although, for example, UK imports very little gas from Russia, gas prices have a global market and are now approximately 480% higher than they were in, for example, 2020. This could cause slowdowns in the European economies, in the Asian economies, in the global economies, and bring in more of this recession problem that we're already facing. Gas supply is short, coal supply is short, and renewables aren't going great. So we're now in this crazy situation. Now we can just hope for favorable weathers. And while forecasters say temperatures are unlikely to be lower than the average year, that's not always accurate, unlike Lars Online. Like last year, for example, weather was much colder than forecasted, and LNG, meaning gas prices in Asia, reached a record high earlier this year. And you see the global gas futures here. They were like 140 at the pandemic, 440 last year, peaked at $10 and still at $8.30. What can Europe do to cope with this crisis? Germany is keeping coal plants in operation that it was going to shut down to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's also keeping the option of reactivating 2 nuclear plants that were set to shut down. The 27-nation EU has approved a plan to reduce gas usage by 15% by next March, roughly the amount experts say they will need to make up for the loss of Russian gas. Hard measures like imprisonment if you keep your home comfortable in the winter or the aircon running in the summer. Crazy, I never thought we would see this in Europe. Then there's also a liquidity crisis part of that, but that has been covered well in other videos, so I won't repeat it. Then politicians will try to introduce price caps. Liz Truss, who took over from Boris Johnson, is planning to freeze household energy bills at the current level for this winter and next, paid for by the government-backed loans to suppliers. This scheme would cost like £100 billion, roughly $116 billion, up to $151 billion. But personally, I don't get it. Won't that just de-incentivize companies from finding solutions? I think the only good news here really is that Europe has managed to fill up 82% of its storage for the winter with the help of LNG and diminished consumption because of high prices and so on. So storage levels have kept rising even after the Nord Stream 1 cutoff. Partly as a result, gas prices have fallen somewhat on the market, although they are still very high. Even President Biden pledged that the US would send more natural gas to the EU in a bid to help Western allies wean themselves off the Russian supply. And it has, but these two regions have physical constraints. There's a limit to how much near-term supplies can keep growing, because the US is basically using all of its available capacity to liquefy the gas, which is necessary to ship the gas overseas, and Europe has limited infrastructure to actually accept imports. And what I can see here is that the debate is warming up to nuclear power again. Conclusion then. My thoughts on how to solve this crisis. So similar to how this crisis was caused from both the demand and the supply side, we have to rethink both demand and supply in order to solve it. On the demand side, the first is to allow the market mechanism to curb demand, while of course supporting the most vulnerable people. Increase energy efficiency, improve insulation of houses and so on. Change some habits perhaps. I think it's fine for consumer prices to rise a little bit, to curtail the demand. That's how market mechanisms works. Then producing electricity becomes more profitable, and we get more electricity as a result, and prices can drop again. The second priority is to also increase supply with something that doesn't depend on Putin's mood. Finding new sources of energy is important, from, I don't know, gas in Qatar, more solar panels from Elon Musk, and also giving nuclear power a fresh take. The best leaders I know always had the motto to do what is right, not what is the most popular in the moment. Living here in Europe, I see much politics being driven increasingly by populism, not by science, or what is actually building the best society. The real solution to this is leadership. Real leadership. Not trying to get by until the next election. Sweden built the probably best energy supply system in the world in my parents' generation, with practically zero CO2 emission, and the stability of that energy grid has fueled much of Sweden's industrial success. Now we're sitting here 40 years later, scrambling, talking about load shedding like in developing countries, while running generators with oil that were meant for temporary switchover work, when having to rebalance between water and nuclear in the 80s. Now we're running them at max capacity full time, shooting out as much CO2 as we can. Europe is begging Putin for gas, while at the same time ramping up sanctions. Seriously, what is going on? Step up. Out with the populist politicians. In with the engineers. In with real scientists. We had good ones 200 years ago. 100 years ago. Carl Sagan explained this in layman's terms in the 1980s in the US. We have good scientists and engineers today as well. The problem isn't that. It's that the politicians haven't listened to them. Real leadership. That's what's needed. And then this can be solved. What I think will happen short term is that the politicians in EU will subsidize everyone and everything to try to win the next elections. That will avoid some of the business problems, but also take their countries further into debt, pushing the problems forward. They will take care of the liquidity crisis. That they know how to do. But to actually solve the problems, as you saw from the technical section of this video, needs real work. Real, gruesome, technical work over a long period of time, longer until the next election. Over decades. For me, this analysis has strengthened 5 of my key convictions. Short term, the market risk remains high. I'm not rushing to buy back until I see real solid evidence. In the traditional markets and about the DXY, if you didn't see my video 2 days ago, that video is what you actually need to manage the Bitcoin and crypto markets. It was released before this recent dump. Maybe rewatch it in the light of this video and the dump that actually happened. Number 2, long term. I'm very bullish on global technology like Bitcoin in competition with fiat currencies when seeing the level of mismanagement by increasingly populist politicians. It's really reaching new heights, guys. Number 3, we need to do more, much more, to actually create energy which doesn't emit CO2, because right now we're heading in the wrong direction. Gas, coal and oil are all increasing, and natural gas is just a marketing statement. Number 4, solar, which is down here, is actually environmentally friendly. Elon Musk is right, unsurprisingly. And my 5th conclusion is that you should subscribe to CTO Larsson for insights you won't get elsewhere. Thank you, tack. CTO Larsson out. Hej då!